WWE has thrown a lot of ideas at the wall over the years, and while some of these have succeeded in a big way, such was the case with the first WrestleMania in 1985, the move towards an edgier product in the late 90s, or going public at the turn of the millennium, not everything they've touched has turned to gold. No, on some occasions, these ideas haven't managed to catch on, leading to some very notable and sometimes costly failures. But which of these ideas were the worst of all? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into failed concepts, WWE's short-lived ideas. And if we're starting off anywhere, we of course have to start with the big one, and that's the time Vince McMahon failed to relaunch WCW in 2001. But we're not talking about the Invasion storyline, that one's already been discussed in detail over on our video on that subject. What we're talking about instead is WWF's original plans to have the Southern Wrestling promotion be revived as a completely separate promotion, with them from there replacing Raw in its weekly Monday night spot. And this all began when Vince McMahon formally bought the company in March of 2001, a move which finally left him as the last man standing in the Monday Night Wars that had been raging throughout much of the 90s. Of course, for as much of a victory as this was, he also understood that now, with no one opposing him and driving him and his company towards new levels of success, he would have to create his own competition going forward. And the obvious choice for this competition then was WCW, with the boss immediately setting about shopping the brand around to different TV companies in the hopes that he would find a buyer. Unfortunately though, by this point, WCW's reputation had been so tarnished by years of terrible booking, no one wanted anything to do with it. And on top of that, the USA Network, the very channel which aired WWF's flagship show at the time, wasn't exactly happy with the idea of the company creating further competition for their viewership every week on another channel. So trying to please both sides then, McMahon would pitch USA on the idea of having WCW take over their Monday night slot, effectively replacing Raw with Nitro, all while WWF continued to air their weekly product over on SmackDown. And to test this out then, the July 2nd, 2001 episode of The Red Brand would feature a full-blown WCW main event featuring then-world champion Booker T taking on Buff Bagwell, complete with Nick Patrick acting as a referee, Stacy Keibler as a ring announcer, and Arn Anderson and Scott Hudson on commentary. Unfortunately though, by then, the fact that WWF fans had spent so many years being conditioned to hate anything WCW, combined with the reality of the match not featuring any of the real big stars of the promotion, like the NWO, Sting, or Goldberg, led to the whole thing being rejected by the live crowd. And this would cause McMahon to immediately scrap the whole idea going forward, with him instead starting the much loathed Invasion angle over the next few weeks instead. Yes, well, he would eventually make the whole idea work somewhat better a year later when he instituted the brand split and fully separated the Raw and SmackDown rosters. It would be a notable example of Vince's Midas touch failing to work out for him. And that wasn't the only failed idea he'd been involved with during this period either, because a few years prior to this, when WWF was on its biggest mainstream kick it had ever been on, the boss would try his very best to ruin all his momentum with the introduction of the Brawl For All. That's right, the Brawl For All, a concept which ranks right up there alongside the Reverse Battle Royal and making himself world champion as one of Vince Russo's worst ideas. But of course, McMahon would have to okay the idea for it to go ahead, with this being something he seemed only too happy to do up once the whole thing was explained to him. So what was the idea for this one? Well, basically, it was to try and take a number of wrestlers, many of who were untrained in legit fighting, and have them compete in a number of shoot bouts on Raw during the summer of 1998. Why did Russo think this would be a good idea? Well, you may not have heard, but wrestling is fake. So as the head writer of the show at the time then, he'd come to believe that this was what was stopping them reaching the next level, and that if they wanted to get even more people watching, they would have to present real fights on screen. Of course, this had the effect of immediately making everything else on the show look even faker as a result, and even worse than that, the tournament itself would lead to a number of performers picking up legit injuries, as with many of them not knowing what they were doing in a real combat sports situation, they were left hung out to dry. But that wasn't even the worst of it, because many of those who did escape injury-free would be exposed for not being as tough as their characters suggested when they were knocked out during the early rounds, with the most notable names among these being Bob Holly, Brackus, and Dr. Death's Steve Williams. So maybe it was for the best then that this one was never tried again, as had they done so, it would have only ruined some more careers. That said, it wasn't the only time WWE tried out the idea of the underground fighting ring-style gimmick on their TV, because years later, when ratings were hitting all-time lows and the company were looking for something to excite fans all over again, they would introduce Raw Underground. And as we hinted, the idea behind this was similar to the Brawl For All in that it presented a more shoot-style fighting situation, something which appeared to have been based on the underground fight rings seen in movies such as Fight Club. In a wise move though, these weren't legit shoot fights. No, instead, they were made to look as such, as during the third hour of Raw in the early months of the global shutdown, the likes of Dolph Ziggler, Braun Strowman, and Dabo Kato would duke it out in the middle of a circle of wrestlers, all while Shane McMahon commentated over the whole thing and tried to bring some life to it. And while it could have been an interesting concept if some of the kinks were worked out, in the end, it would never get to that point because, after only a couple of months, the whole thing would be scrapped. But getting quickly scrapped would be a fate which also befell a concept introduced over on SmackDown a couple of years prior to this, because despite it seeming like it might reinvigorate things for a while, the Blue Brand's ranking system would ultimately end up falling to the wayside. That's right, before AEW repopularized the idea of a ranking system for top contenders in wrestling, WWE would briefly try it out in early 2018, with the idea here being that every week, a list of the top 10 contenders would be published, allowing fans to chart where each superstar sat and who was going to be in line for a title shot next. Unfortunately though, with the company's incredibly erratic booking at this point, there was no chance in hell it was ever going to play out like that, as with plans changing week to week and sometimes hour to hour, the idea of creating long-term stories based on a ranking system simply wasn't possible. And that was what led to the whole thing quickly regressing into an excuse to start a storyline between Randy Orton, Bobby Roode, Jinder Mahal, and Rusev when all four became jealous over their peers' position. Yes, it could have been something, and now that Vince McMahon is gone from WWE, maybe it's an idea that could work again someday. One idea that's unlikely to ever be tried again, however, is the failed attempt to appeal to a younger market that was NXT Kids. Of course, we all know NXT for its glory days of being the black and gold super indie which introduced fans to the likes of Kevin Owens, Johnny Gargano, and Adam Cole. On top of that, we all remember its prior game show format where it gave us people like Daniel Bryan and Wade Barrett, as well as its more recent 2.0 rebranding, which has seen stars of the future like Braun Breaker first get exposure to a larger audience. What you might not remember, however, was that in 2015, in an attempt to draw in younger viewers, WWE would create a pilot episode of NXT Kids, a show which, acting in a similar vein to the prior Saturday Morning Slam show, was supposed to appeal to preteens by, amongst other things, actually having two children named Tucker and Drew join Corey Graves on the commentary booth. On top of that, child-friendly performers such as Bayley and Billie Kay would fill out the match order. Sadly though, and perhaps unsurprisingly, this one would never make it out of the starting blocks as, after apparently not seeing enough in the concept, WWE would decide to drop it at the pilot stage. That said, it didn't stop this from eventually getting leaked online, giving fans everywhere a view into what could have been in the process. But when it comes to our next entry, we know very well how it ultimately played out, and given how poorly it ultimately went, maybe it would have been for the best if the company had never tried it at all. Of course, we're talking about the Wildcard Rule that Vince McMahon initiated in 2019. And why did this one fail? Well, it was way too confusing for one thing, as despite initially seeming simple enough, being a new rule which allowed 3 Raw superstars the chance to appear on SmackDown and 3 SmackDown superstars the similar ability to appear on Raw over the course of a calendar year, things quickly got convoluted when more and more people started jumping brands without any rhyme or reason in the weeks and months that followed. Yes, on some weeks, there were upwards of 5 members of the Blue Brand showing up on Monday nights. On top of that, it was unclear how tag team acts worked under this rule, or if someone could keep returning once they'd jumped ship once, with this all causing fans to start questioning how the rule was actually being enforced. And the answer to this was it wasn't being enforced at all, as with Vince McMahon regularly tearing up and rewriting scripts at the last minute, there was little care being given to any sense of continuity or internal logic. Hell, at one point, the whole thing would even be called out on TV when Kevin Owens made a mockery of the entire rule during a promo segment. And that was one of the final nails in the coffin for the whole thing in the end, because despite beginning life as a way to draw fans back by allowing more star power to appear on both shows, it ended up just pushing them further away with all its inconsistencies. So unsurprisingly then, the whole thing would be quietly dropped once SmackDown moved over to Fox later that year, with WWE returning to their old method of just having people seemingly show up on the other brand whenever they felt like it, with there often being no attempt at an explanation given at all anymore. Sure, if the company wanted to have all the stars appear on both shows, they could have just done away with the brand extension altogether, but with them deciding to not do that for some reason, this was the only other hand they had to play. And that, of course, wouldn't be the only idea WWE introduced around this time in an attempt to help turn around their sagging ratings, as, in 2019, they would also announce that, in an attempt to piggyback off the success of the Oculus Rift, the company would be allowing fans to experience their product in full virtual reality for the first time. Of course, if you've already forgotten about this one, it's for good reason, because despite the whole idea having lofty ambitions and even potential loftier rewards if executed correctly, when it was finally made live, it would fail to make much of an impact. Why was this? Well, there were a couple of reasons. First of which was the fact that, with VR still being a relatively new technology and, as such, an expensive one to get involved in, most fans simply didn't have access to the hardware required. On top of that, it quickly became apparent that while being placed directly into the ring via virtual reality technology was a nice novelty, the idea of taking a punch from Kevin Owens or delivering a body slam to Randy Orton didn't really have enough appeal to make people want to invest large sums of money into the whole thing. Still, it didn't stop the company pushing it heavily for a while, with then Chief Revenue and Marketing Officer for WWE, Michelle Wilson, doing everything she could to sell its virtues to both investors and fans. Ultimately, though, it would end up being dropped before it could ever really get started, with it being one of the reasons why Wilson and her cohort George Barrios were later fired from their executive roles, only to be replaced by current co-CEO of the company, Nick Khan. And while Khan's run in WWE has been largely successful in terms of business, he's also seen his share of failed experiments, such as his attempt to increase the company's rate of stadium shows in 2022. That said, we doubt anything he does during the remainder of his tenure with the company will ever flop as hard as WWE's Juniors division did when that was introduced in the mid-2000s. And of course, the idea behind this one was simple. Yes, with a whole influx of smaller stars having recently joined his roster at the time, Vince McMahon would try to create his own version of what the likes of World Championship Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling had done so successfully with their cruiserweight and junior heavyweight divisions in the years prior. But then, maybe alarm bells should have started ringing as soon as this one was announced because, as it turned out, this wasn't the first time the boss had tried to start such a division. No, almost a decade prior to this, he'd have failed to get the light heavyweight roster over too. To be fair, with many of the light heavyweights here getting limited TV time and no stories attached to what they were doing, combined with the fact that the ones who could cut promos in English were usually people like Brian Christopher or Scott Putski, performers who were much closer to heavyweight in size, it was always going to come across as an afterthought. Still, there was a good idea in there to be exploited, as could be seen in such underrated matches like the one Dean Malenko and Scotty 2 Hotty put on at Backlash 2000. And as the new millennium really got going and the WCW Cruiserweight title was fully integrated onto WWF TV then, it felt like with the introduction of Rey Mysterio, Chavo Guerrero, and others, there might finally be a place for it. So hoping that maybe McMahon had learned from his mistakes, fans had their interest piqued in 2005 when it was announced that going forward, SmackDown would be branding the Cruiserweights as now being part of an all-new Juniors division, an idea which had first been pitched by then behind-the-scenes writer and current boss of Major League Wrestling, Court Bauer. Unfortunately, though, it pretty quickly became apparent that, despite Vince McMahon appearing to be on board with the whole thing, this was not going to be a radical reinterpretation of the concept, and instead was going to be an even more watered-down version of what the company had carried out before. Yes, after having already managed to convince the right people in positions of power to sign luchadors such as Juventud Guerrera, Ultimo Dragon, and Psychosis, Bauer's plans would ultimately stumble when, upon hoping to add some Japanese talent too, turning the whole thing into WWE's version of the Super Juniors from NJPW, it would instead be decided by then Vice President of Talent Relations John Laurinaitis that what they really needed was some little people wrestlers. And while many of these wrestlers were very talented, the division was ultimately pigeonholed as being a comedic one, and certainly something that wasn't on the level of what the heavyweights were doing. Yes, the likes of Super Porky, Masquerita Sagrada, and Pitbull Patterson just weren't able to compete on a show with a stack of top stars at the time like Batista, Randy Orton, and John Cena. So no longer wanting anything to do with the whole thing then, Bauer and the rest of the writing team would start to neglect it, with all of it only leading to it flopping even harder. 5 months later, and the whole thing would be scrapped completely when Fit Finlay came out during a segment on SmackDown and attacked several of the minis, signaling to audiences both watching live and at home that the division was well and truly over. Yes, it could have been something great, but would ultimately fail. That said, there are some even more forgettable blunders in WWE history, with one of the biggest of all being Hulk Hogan's infamous War Bonnet. Forgotten about this one? Well, that's because it didn't really last long. Basically, it all started when, after filming No Holds Barred in 1988, the Hulkster finally came to the same realization we'd all come to already, that his hair was starting to go. And being a man who was all about his image then, this hit Hogan hard, causing him to start thinking of new ways he might be able to hide this going forward. But while his red and yellow do-rag would ultimately have more staying power, it wasn't his first choice, as prior to that, he'd introduce his War Bonnet, a pretty ridiculous-looking helmet in the style of a Roman centurion that was just as embarrassing then as it was for Farouk years later. Even more so, in fact, because this one went as far as to sport a fist punching its way out of the forehead, predating the famous SmackDown set by a full 2 decades. Perhaps that was why it never actually made it onto TV then, as after using it on the house show circuit for a while during runs with Bad News Brown and the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase, the Hulkster would end up retiring the whole thing, leaving to fall into the forgotten parts of history, the very same place where the Hulk Hogan license plate ended up too. Yes, it wasn't just a bad helmet Terry Bollea was testing out during this period as, at the same time, he'd also made the baffling choice to start wearing a Hulkster emblazoned license plate around his neck. Well, we say baffling, but in truth, there was a logic behind it, and the logic was all the potential money which could be made from selling replicas of it. Still, it doesn't make it any less of a bad idea, and probably one which Hogan wishes he could forget. And when it comes to forgotten short-lived ideas, it takes something truly special to make a concept introduced only a few years ago feel like it never happened, as is the case with Raw Dark. Yes, it's not just AEW who had a show called Dark, because in 2019, in an attempt to boost ratings during the always difficult to get through third hour of Raw, WWE would try something new when they had Mick Foley come out on the May 20th episode of the Red Brand to announce that not only were the company reintroducing the hardcore division in the form of the new 24/7 title, but that going forward, the third hour of Raw would now be rebranded as Raw Dark. And the insinuation here then was that Raw Dark would feature a more risque, edgier product, something closer to what had been seen during the boom period of the Attitude Era. Of course, in the end, the third hour of Raw would look much the same as it ever had, albeit now with the inclusion of a comedy hardcore division once more. So that was why, after only a few weeks, the whole concept would be quietly dropped, never to be referenced again. And just like Raw Dark ended, that's where we'll end things for today too, because as we've seen with some of the failed concepts we've looked at, sometimes it's better to call it quits when you have the chance. So maybe now, with Triple H and Power of Creative, they'll be able to try some of these concepts again. And who knows, if they're doing it their way, some of these concepts might turn out to be a success. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.